Hello, just a bit of housekeeping before we start. First of all, as you may have seen from the title, this is the second half of a video all about my work in progress, so if you haven't seen the first, I'd recommend you go check that out just so you're all up to speed. Secondly, I do need to mention that I speak quite candidly about my thoughts and feelings on religion in this video, so if you prefer not to listen to that part, I will leave a little warning in the top left hand corner, so just watch out for that. Otherwise, check out some of my other videos where Ink and I talk all things story. Alright, to the video! Now this comment was growing on my mind. It brought back memories of the fantasy novels that boomed for us generation of kids, and the sheer scope and size they possessed when you collated all the books of the series together. Eager to rediscover my love for reading, I returned to the realm of fantasy literature once more, and much like how I discovered the movies that inspired me to study screen and media, I surfed the web for the very best fantasy books the world had on offer. I took to one in particular. I've mentioned it on this channel. This book really acted as the catalyst to take my project in a completely different direction. I loved the depth of the world building and the arts that made the Four Corners the beautiful place that it was. I loved the life that Rothfuss breathed into the diverse and unsettled characters. I loved his use of language and the downright pleasant pace at which we totter along with the story. But most of all, I loved the close, almost intimate perspective of our MC, Koth, as well as the framed narrative that separates us from the man of renown he once was and the troubled figure he'd become. Right around the same time of reading the Kingkiller books, I was cleaning house with my work in progress. As much as I was inspired by the Spanish conquest of Mexico, it was becoming evident that I was tackling an event too grand in scale to try and pull from. The bridge between the story I wanted to tell with my characters and the historic events that took place was starting to crumble, and ultimately, I had to let it. But now, I had new insight into the scope of my story, were it in the form of a book. All the work I'd done with the screenwriting I was quite sure I could implement into a novel. Of course, only taking the best stories from the episodes I'd written. It would be broken into 4 parts, and much like the Kingkiller books, would have a framed narrative in between. This is when I started to come up with Skye. From the distant future, Skye was an archaeologist working for the non-for-profit scavenging team, the Pilgrims of Verity, a government initiative tasked with finding much-needed information on the Enigma, a supernatural humanoid entity responsible for centuries of death and destruction throughout the known regions of the universe. She had landed in Drutenka, and using only the most advanced telescopic technology, she peers back into Drutenka's distant past, in a time when Isel was still alive, and follows along with his journey hoping to find a clue that will lead to the Enigma's discovery. It was around 2018 when I first got started writing the book, punching words into an online Word doc where and when I could. While I wrote most of the manuscript on my desktop and tablet, I picked up the funny habit of doing revisions on my phone. There was no method to the madness. It was just a matter of getting the story in my head out on paper. The only rule I gave myself was to have every chapter at least 4,000 words long, and my only reason for that was because that was what other fantasy books I'd read had done. Even though it was the wrong way to go about it, I was writing. The story of Isel's long journey to his mentor's homeland, which I'd only half finished with the screenplays, was finally coming to fruition. But Skye's narrative turned out to be a real struggle. I loved the concept of her exploring my world in a dystopian sci-fi setting, finding the odd clue that ties back to the main narrative. Only I was really struggling to pin down the particulars, as well as who she was as a character. The first major roadblock came in the realization that the science behind the telescope she was using, while having some elements of truth, simply wasn't plausible. When it comes to sci-fi, I believe you can stretch the particulars of a science for the sake of artistic liberty, but ultimately, I felt a telescope that could see thousands of years into the past was too unbelievable a concept for readers to buy. So I scrapped the telescope idea, which left me with a character on a barren planet without a means to complete her goal. And unsure how to address that concern, I set Skye's story to the wayside to focus on Isel's story, giving a lot of thought to the transformation he would make over the course of his journey. Being a story so deeply rooted in religion, it seemed inevitable that spirituality would be its primary theme, and there was no way I could write something like this without having something to say about it. It was around that time that I saw the Netflix documentary Abducted in Plain Sight. For those unfamiliar, and I'll spare you the grim details, it's the true recounting of Robert Berchtold's controversial interactions with the deeply devout Broberg family, and how he preyed on their trusting, caring nature for his own perverse and immoral gain. As you can imagine, much of the reaction behind the documentary centered around chastising the Broberg family's faith in Robert, and how blind they were for not being privy to his intentions. And there was something about this reaction in particular that bothered me. It's not that I disagree. Obviously the Broberg family shouldn't have let Robert get away with any of his crimes. But I felt this family's ability to have such blind faith in their neighbour was so grossly overlooked. And then, something clicked for me. Why are we letting people like Robert, who are such a small minority, set a standard for how well we should trust and treat one another? In this day and age, and understandably so, it's becoming increasingly difficult to accept the stories told in the texts of organised religion. You look closely enough, and pretty soon, you start finding some inconsistencies that are hard to deny. This, among many other contributing factors, is what's led to a profound increase in atheism. I'm not at a point where I know for sure if we're better off this way, but what I do know is that we can't treat these religious texts like they no longer have any value just because their stories...
That's a dumb canard. Come on, the atheism had nothing to do...
may or may not have been disproven. The fact of the matter is, if you've been around a moment, you'll know that people in these devout communities can be some of the kindest, most caring, and most trusting people you'll ever meet. And unless I'm not looking properly, I've yet to see a community outside of organised religion that demonstrates this same level of hospitality, this same unconditional love for thy neighbour, so to speak. That faith is something we'd all benefit from adopting. And while I think it's great we're questioning these doctrines and their historical ramifications, I worry we'll lose sight of that faith if we continue down this road of impiety. That's been the ultimate message with this project, one I'm attempting to relay through Isel's story. And oddly enough, because of its religious foundations, I managed to find a way. In the wake of COVID, which shut down Melbourne's events industry and essentially left me without work, I found the time to pour a lot more effort into completing my manuscript, and in September of 2020, I finished a draft that clocked in at 180,000 words. Being 7 years in the making, it was needless to say, a surreal experience to finally have this story down on paper. But there was still a lot of work to be done. Even with the amount I downscaled from the original scripts, I could tell from the read-through that there was simply too much going on for the average reader to make sense of. With that in mind, I set about trimming the story even more, culling characters who had no stake in the core narrative or any relevance to my MCs. I finished another draft in the early part of 2021 that clocked in at 120,000 words, and feeling confident enough for a second opinion, I sent the manuscript out to some beta readers. The reviews were mixed. People liked the world I had built, and were fond of the flow of my writing style, the latter critique being particularly encouraging, as up until then I'd never even written a book before. However, most of the readers found the plot of the story difficult to follow along with, struggling to differentiate the active scenes from the reactionary ones. Another common criticism was that my readers couldn't connect emotionally with my MC. This was a big concern of mine, as his point of view scenes comprise of roughly 80% of the book. For a time, I tried to remedy this emotional connection issue with more study and practice of third-person deep POV, but the more introspection I added to the narrative, the more forced my writing seemed to become. This was when I started to question why I'd written in third person in the first place, seeing as I only had two, primarily one, point of view characters. It dawned on me that I didn't have much of a reason why. As far as I could recall, When I started writing the book in 2018, third person limited was just what came naturally. So I wrote some scenes with Isel in first person present, and it quite quickly became evident that this was always how I was supposed to tell the story. But it also meant I would have to completely rewrite my manuscript. That's where I'm up to currently. I'm nearly halfway through another rewrite and my manuscript is so much better off with this change in narration style. With a bit of luck, I'm hoping to have Pilgrims of Verity published by the end of next year, and I'm hoping in the years to come that I'll find a way to streamline my writing process so that I can establish a routine of some kind. Guys, thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, be sure to give us a thumbs up, and if you're into story-related content, do consider subscribing to the channel because Ink and I talk all things story. Oh, look at this. Just crashing my spot.
Look at these, just crashing my spot. Good people, be sure to tune in next time. We're going to look into serial killer stories and how to tell them responsibly. And most importantly, this douche won't be there.